Hi guys, welcome back to the Higher Man podcast. It is good to be back. It's been a few weeks since we last done our latest episode. Currently, it is 10:29 a.m. on Friday, the 27th of January, 2023. This is episode 22, hosted by yours truly, K-Lock, and my co-host Pete. How are we doing today?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good to be back on the pod after a few week hiatus, having exams and stuff. So we've been quite busy, but hopefully we can start smashing them out again now.
Yeah, should get back into the normal routine. I'm starting uni again for semester 2 next week, so I'll be ready and available on certain days. I think you'll be similar sort of case, I think.
Yeah, same with me.
Yeah, well, today we are just, I guess it's kind of a bit more of an introductory video back into normal life. So we've not got anything massively planned, but we've got a few pointers we can talk about. We're going to go on from sort of like philosophy, religious teachings. Do you need to act within the accordance of those teachings to be a true follower? Stuff like that. Yeah, so today I thought we'd start the episode with Jordan Peterson's idea of if you stare into the abyss long and hard enough, eventually you'll find the light. I quite liked this idea when I initially heard it. It's sat with me for a while and I agreed with it, but then I was listening to a podcast of Theo Von's with his guest James Blake, and Theo said you can act your way into positive thinking, but you can't think your way into positive action. And these two ideas sort of contradict in my mind. Like Jordan Peterson says, if you sit with yourself and contemplate almost the tragedies of life, and like the negative aspects of it, you can find the positive aspects of it. And Theo Von, on the other hand, is saying you don't think first you act, and then positive thinking ends up becoming a symptom of positive action. So, like, what are your ideas on that, Pete?
Yeah, my initial thought on it was with the statement of if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss will stare back into you, and then if you stare beyond that, then you can see the light. That type of idea. I think the idea of staring into the abyss, it doesn't necessarily mean just sitting and passively kind of like waiting and observing. It can be a matter of kind of stepping into the abyss, like moving forwards in that kind of direction, like confronting the difficulties of life head on. And that can be through action, not necessarily through passive observation. Although, having said that, I do also think there is some value in not necessarily taking action, but kind of learning about the tragedies of the world, learning about the evil people are capable of. And that can be kind of in a passive way, whether that be like reading a book, for example. Like you're not necessarily taking it. I guess you are taking action in some respects by reading the book, but you're not actually doing anything. You're just passively learning. But yeah, so I don't think the statement necessarily stops you from, it is necessarily saying to passively not to take action. I think it can be to take action. But even having said that, I think more passively just learning about things and contemplating them has its value in and of itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, but like I think like you phrased it better, like stare into the abyss long enough and the abyss will stare at you, and stare beyond that, then you'll find the light. I think it can be hard for a lot of people to get to the point of where the abyss stares back at them. And when the abyss does stare back at them, I think that possibly can become overwhelming for a lot of people. And regardless of being overwhelmed or not, if you have discipline through and act, even when you don't want to act, you'll kind of move beyond that point of being like paralyzed by fear. So I do think there is like a huge teaching on what Theo Von is saying, like even when because you can contemplate stuff and you can you can contemplate stuff, but if what you're contemplating really does overwhelm you, you need to act regardless of that. So, yeah. And I think traversing through the world by acting does teach you things inevitably. So I guess that if you stare into the abyss, I think people can become a bit sidelined by trying to think about this, and they kind of become their own echo chamber in their own mind. Whereas if you just act, you take lessons from what you learn in life, and you understand how things work in like context of an actual situation. But I don't know, they kind of match up to me, but they don't at the same time. I don't really know how to explain it.
Yeah, just thinking about it now, like the thing about staring into the abyss, like it seemed like a good idea to me, but it's been somewhat abstract, and I haven't really thought like directly how practically it can work in someone's life. But just thinking about it now, staring into the abyss, and the abyss will stare back into you, but beyond that, you can see the light. Like that could be in the context of deciding to take a difficult path in life. And initially, you're simply going to be faced with the difficulty, and that will be the abyss staring back into you, the difficulty, the darkness, the discomfort. Like this, if you start doing something difficult, then you will feel those things, and you'll feel the presence and the darkness of the abyss. But only once you move through that, you can see the light when you start to reap the rewards of your positive actions. So yeah, I do actually think the statement works even better as a means to take action. Like you step into the abyss, you move into the abyss. You don't necessarily, like I said, it's not necessarily a passive thing. And like an example I'm thinking of, like a small example in my own life, is deciding to get up early to go to jiu-jitsu in the mornings. And especially at this time of year, it's cold and quite unpleasant riding my bike over there. So getting up early, like riding in the cold, like these are quite uncomfortable things. And like when doing them, there's really no like redeeming factors to having to get up and go in the cold. Like that is just shit. Like, I'm sorry, but it's just not enjoyable. But so that's kind of the abyss, the discomfort you have to go through. But then if you're willing to go through that, then you can see the light. And in terms of Theo Von's statement, I think it's absolutely right, because in those situations, I can think all I want. It's not going to make it any easier or more difficult. Like I just need to, it doesn't really matter what I'm thinking. I just need to get up and do it. So I think they do actually kind of work together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there can be, I think the problem with what I found with it, maybe I just thought the staring into the abyss was all about contemplation and exploring in your own mind the tragedies of life. So maybe I misinterpreted, but like how much of staring into the abyss should be action, be thinking? It probably should be majority action. But surely there needs to be some sort of like conscious effort to explore ideas in your mind and like explore why you do this and why you don't do that.
Yeah, I think there is a distinction there, because it's kind of quite a broad principle that can be applied to a lot of different things. So I've just explained there a context in which it's about taking difficult action, and then you move through that to get a reward. But like another aspect of staring into the abyss could be more related to what we spoke about in terms of realizing the shadow. And one way to do that is through reading about history and finding out about the atrocities that people have committed, and then realizing that I forget who said it. It's probably was Carl Jung. It said something along the lines of like, you need to realize that all the evils of humanity, you have them within you. So realizing through studying literature how evil people can be, that's staring into the darkness, and then you realize the darkness within yourself. But then once again, by the benefits of integrating that, there'll eventually be a light if you're able to go through that darkness, which you never would have been able to find had you remained naive. So, but even so, it's still an active process, isn't it? It's not a, I think regardless of whether you're taking physical action or you're sitting back and contemplating, both of those things are actually doing. And there are certain contexts where, like, you can't think yourself into getting a good workout in. You just have to go and do the workout. But, you know, that there are things you can actively do just through thinking, which don't necessarily require physical action, but it's still taking action. You know, so yeah, I think action always is important, even if it is contemplating in an active way, if you understand.
Yeah, I understand. Do you think that action v thinking, does one of them have to always come first, or does it depend on the situation? Like you said, for example, that workout, it's kind of inevitable that you think about what you're going to do in the next few moments. And obviously, if you're going to go work out, you have to think about putting your clothes on, getting to the gym, or whatever. So do you think that thinking maybe is always the precursor, or that acting is maybe always the precursor, or like there's a balance between the two?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say, because thinking can be good or bad. So like, you can think about it and that can motivate you to do something, or you can think about it and it makes you want to avoid the discomfort. So I think it can work both ways, but at the end of the day, it's always the action that takes place. Having said that, something we've mentioned before is about how, something I learned from Andrew Huberman, about how your thoughts and stuff, like if you think about the positive benefits of the actions you take, then that can stimulate dopamine in your brain to make you more likely to do the thing.
Yeah.
So if you're doing something difficult and you remind yourself that the difficulty will make you stronger, and if that's a mindset and thoughts that you develop, then, you know, in that case, you're winning the mental battle, and that's allowing you to push yourself more physically. So, you know, it's not completely black and white, but I do think there's a lot of value in just being able to ignore your feelings and thoughts and emotions for the sake of doing something which deep down you know is right.
Yeah, that's just discipline, isn't it?
Yeah, that's discipline.
I think I'd be interested to see what Jordan Peterson says in the explanation of that statement in like more depth, and see what he believes. But talking about Theo Von, he himself is a comedian, and my cousin questioned me the other day and asked, do I believe that stand-up comedians could almost be akin to modern-day philosophers? My initial response was, I don't think they are. I think they have some good teachings, but in my mind it seemed that to be a philosopher, you kind of had to act within accordance of your teachings. And you had to live by the values that you set out to teach people. He disagreed with me. I can't remember the name of the philosopher. I think it was like Diogenes, or Diogenes. He was going to be one of the top philosophers, like philosopher's favorite philosopher, and he was not necessarily the best human at times. Like, he didn't necessarily act the right way at all times. So what do you think about that? Do you need to be a true follower of what you teach to be a teacher of it?
There's a lot to unpack there. I think maybe if we start with what are comedians philosophers? Are they modern day philosophers? And, you know, it's interesting. I think the role of the comedian is kind of, it's not like a modern thing. It's always been like the role of the jester, is to be able to say things that other people aren't willing to say, kind of hard truths, things, the elephant in the room that people don't want to talk about, but be able to say that. And like something I've heard said is about how if you're in a tyranny, the jester or the comedian won't be able to speak, because if they say something bad about the leadership, then they'll be punished for it, or they won't be allowed. They'll be killed. They'll be put in prison. So I think in that way there is a philosophical element to being a comedian, where you are trying to say uncomfortable truths, which is certainly part of being a philosopher. But I maybe wouldn't go as far to say that comedians are necessarily philosophers, as like they're not. A lot of the things they say, they're not particularly serious about. Then it's not a, it's like the things they say aren't necessarily guiding principles to live your life by. They're kind of just difficult truths. But what parts of being a comedian do you think make them like a philosopher?
I don't know. I was listening to a podcast with Louis C.K. and he was talking about how comedians push the boundaries of what is known in their like experience compared to other people's experience. And he gave the example, I think it was is it Morgan Tracy, that famous comedian?
I'm not sure.
But he's a black guy who came from like a bit of a rough neighborhood, grew up to become a comedian. I think it's Morgan Tracy. He's a bit of a crazy guy. And he talks about how like he had this joke where he's fine with his son being like homosexual or whatever, but if he acts like a really flamboyant homosexual, he'd like punch him. And it was just a joke. And like Louis C.K. was saying, like the experience that Morgan Tracy had growing up was you couldn't act and show weakness in your neighborhood growing up, because then you'd be a target, and he didn't want that for his son. And in contrary to that, people would say, "Oh, you're being homophobic by saying your son can't act gay and be like flamboyant or whatever." And I think comedians, through jokes, push the boundaries of what is like acceptable from compared to one community to the other, and that can kind of spark discussion, or it should spark healthy discussion and debate between like two different opposing views. So I think that's where a lot of benefit can come from. Although in today's bloody world, like you can't say anything without getting cancelled, which is just a bit of bullshit, really, because it just shuts down conversation.
Yeah, I think comedians still, I wouldn't be so pessimistic to say that, they can't say anything without being cancelled. I still think comedians do play that role, and it hasn't gone so far to the point where they're not able to say controversial things. They'll get ridiculed for it, but that's fine, isn't it? As long as they're not deplatformed or anything, which I haven't really seen happen to.
But how important is it?
Any comedians?
I think you're right that they themselves might not get cancelled and deplatformed, but I think it's so important that they spark the conversation, and it's important for that conversation to get carried on by just general people in society. Mm-hmm. But I think the problem is today that people who are just in society as normal people, they can't carry that conversation on that sparked by a comedian, because then they risk getting cancelled or like ridiculed, and then they can actually have like severe consequences for their own lives.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk nowadays more than ever that you can't that you risk your own personal downfall if you decide to talk about certain things. But I still think that's probably a risk worth taking, and if you are in pursuit of the truth, then ultimately, even if it doesn't work out the best for you, it's still maybe the right thing to do. Yeah.
But do you think that the comedians, although they spark the conversation, and that's important, what happens if, because of the cancel culture, all that happens from that conversation being sparked is people talk about it within their own groups, and you get echo chambers, mm-hmm. rather than having a conversation between the opposing ideas? Like, do you think that's a bit of a risk where everyone hears something, like everyone hears, for example, like a transgender joke from Dave Chappelle, and rather than the two different like ideas of coming together and conversing, you just get people going back to their own echo chambers and like getting more radical, let's say.
Yeah, I think even beyond kind of cancel culture, I think the internet in general promotes that. Like, even if cancel culture wasn't a thing, the fact,
Right.
and maybe the reason cancel culture developed was because the internet had echo chambers where people who were easily offended gathered to, try and deplatform people. Like, they perhaps gathered power through being in this echo chamber. And I think the thing with the internet is it allows people to consume like a ridiculous amount of content and interact with more people than we ever would have been able to without the internet, who have the exact same views as yourself. And because that's positively reinforcing, why are you going to go out and seek out things that you don't agree with or you think are dumb or go against your values? And there's probably a problem on all sides. Like, I'm not gonna actively seek out going onto someone's page like who I don't resonate with their values at all. The same way someone who maybe has an extreme view of things, in this case, like the cancel culture would be kind of an extreme left-wing person usually. Like, they're not going to seek out more centrist or right-wing points of view or interact with those types of people when you can simply consume content that you agree with. So I think maybe that's probably a large part of the roots of cancel culture. And I think, these echo chambers is an issue with the internet. So yeah, it's tough though, because you don't want to, like, to what extent do you think people should seek out different ideas? Because, there's another idea that you should kind of guard the gates of your mind, so to speak. And if you think someone's got shit ideas which are going to negatively influence you, like, how much time or energy should you take, like, moving in that direction, trying to learn about these people's ideas if you just think that they're toxic?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So, like, in my mind, it's sort of like similar to religion. Like, if you believe in your religion and you attend your church like once or twice a week, should you necessarily make time once a month to go to another religion's place of worship and stuff like that, even if their values go against yours? I don't know. I think there's always going to be benefit from discourse and exploring this idea, be that idea, because even if you come to the conclusion that your idea and your beliefs are ones that should be protected even further because of the exploration of other people's opposing views, all that does is just strengthen your own beliefs, and that's like a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can quantify how much time needs to be attended to for that, but I think, I don't know, is it even possible to quantify? Like, less than, I think, like something like a fifth of your time.
Yeah, it's difficult to quantify, isn't it?
Yeah, because I mean, the conversation you have that takes up 5% of your time might be worth more than the conversation that takes up 50% of your time that day or whatever.
Yeah, but it's a good point you make that exploring different viewpoints will lead you to have stronger, more well-informed values, because you explore the other side and the reasons why the other side isn't necessarily applicable, rather than just blindly following what you initially believe. So yeah, it strengthens your points of view. So there's certainly value in that.
Yeah. Do you think people kind of get scared though of exploring other people's ideas? Like, if someone's like, for example, like a really, really religious Catholic, and they don't take time to explore like Judaism or Islam or Buddhism, do you think people do that possibly out of fear that they might realise or be taught something that goes against what they believe in? in Catholicism.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is a big fear that people have of, because when you might encounter an idea that completely destroys what you currently believe, and like I don't think that's necessarily an irrational fear either. And you know, some ideas can be very alluring and attractive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're right, or that they're a way to live your life. Like an example, I don't know if you're familiar with like the black pill community online. Have you heard of black pill?
I've heard of them. I don't know what they're.
Yeah, so like there's like blue pill, red pill. I don't know if you've heard of them either.
Yeah, I've heard of them. I think I know what they are, but
I'll explain it briefly. So blue pill is kind of these ideas are like, well, it comes from the original metaphor comes from the Matrix, where the blue pill is basically you can remain in ignorance. Then the red pill is you can discover the truth.
Yeah.
And then black pill is kind of an extension upon that, but it's kind of in like the manosphere, like the men's space, talking about men's issues and stuff, and about dating and stuff for men. Like the blue pill idea is that, like with dating in particular, as it's easy to explain, like blue pill is thinking, oh, if I just find the right person, then they'll love me, and if I'm just really nice to them all the time, then we'll live happily ever after. And then the red pill idea would be uncovering that, like, there are kind of more superficial things that people judge things off, like the hypergamous nature of females, like that type of thing. And then the black pill, so the red pill presents those ideas and says things like, yeah, you need to make more money if you want to be more attractive to women, or you need to improve yourself in different ways. And then the black pill kind of agrees with the red pill's premise that the blue pill is wrong, but it goes down the direction of a hopelessness, that there is no hope. Like it's determined by factors like your bone structure or something, or height, like more things that you can't control. Whereas the red pill would turn towards things that you can control as the reason. Right. And I think so. The original point I was making was the black pill community, which tells people to be hopeless and to give up on what they truly want. Like that can be a very attractive idea for like a young man or a young boy who's struggling and doesn't really believe in themselves. So if they take time to go into that idea, then they can become possessed by it, even though it's not a good idea and it's not a good way to live your life in that hopeless way. And yeah, I think another example is in terms of religion. It's like if someone's religious and they're living out these principles that make them live a better life, like, is it actually bad for them to really confront the truth of, like, if they become obsessed with the scientific way of things and become an atheist, and that destroys their religious values? Is that actually a good thing for them, or will that negatively affect their life? So I think there is great danger in exploring different ideas, and it's not an irrational fear for people, but I think I do believe that seeking out the truth is still the right thing to do. But to your question about people being scared, like, yeah, I definitely do think people are scared of confronting things which completely destroy their current way of viewing things, their current way of life, because our identities are so attached to our beliefs, and it's almost having your identity destroyed sometimes if you really confront something that destroys your beliefs. So it's a lot more comfortable for people to stay in the zone of what they believe and just to consume things that they agree with.
Yeah, be willfully blind, so not to be blinded by the new light you see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or to be swallowed by the darkness.
Yeah. Yeah, what about... I mean, I know it's difficult for people to kind of identify themselves as just themselves. Like you said, it seems like people need to attach their own identity to like symbols or like different teachings or like ideas about what life is. Do you think maybe we're almost too intellectual now to simply identify ourselves as just a human being that's wandering about the earth? And because we're so intellectual and we understand what belonging is and what group culture is and all these other things, that we need to be a part of that.
Yeah, it's hard to say how much of a problem it really is. Like, is it wrong for us to be attached to our beliefs and our values as our identity? Because it is kind of what makes up like the decisions we decide to live our life by.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it's a trivial thing, which is just as if we'd be better just completely dispensing of. But to be fair, there is also the argument that we might be better, and like through something like meditation, you can learn to detach from your ideas and your thoughts and be able to just experience life in kind of the present moment. So there's certainly value in that. But what do you think? How much?
I think it's very important. Like the phrase I used was, should we just identify with ourselves and go about wandering the earth? That would apply more so to an animal that lives in solitude, like maybe like a polar bear or something. But when we're a herd animal, in my mind, like we need to be in a social community for the community and for the individuals in that community to thrive. So maybe it's wrong for me to think we can just identify with ourselves, because as a human, we will never truly be just ourselves. We will always be part of the human race, or at least the immediate community that we live in. Mm-hmm. And I think to be a part of that community, you're going to have to identify with similarities that you have with the other people in that community. And maybe that is the only way of living. But then, I don't know, like I've listened to a podcast with a guy who just moved out to Alaska. Like, this was years ago. He moved out to Alaska and lived by himself for months at a time and hunted and gathered what he needed to eat and stuff. And he said he's like unbelievably happy, and like he found such true peace being out there by himself. And that kind of contradicts what I just said then. But maybe he's just an anomaly, and maybe he would have had a better time if he did that, but with a community of people, like say 50 to 100 people, just living off the land. Maybe he would have been even happier doing that. So I don't know, but yeah, I think concluding, I'd say identity is so important, and identifying with other people is just innate in what humans do.
Yeah, I guess the question is how much. So the question is how much of your identity should you attach to your beliefs and values, and perhaps the answer is you should, because on one side you want to be attached enough to them to be willing to fight for them, to stand up for your belief, for what you believe in,
yeah,
and to kind of pursue the truth and try and act that out in the world. You need to, if you just didn't give a shit about them, then like you have no strength in that. But on the other side, there's this idea that you need to let dead woods burn off, or you'll eventually be destroyed. Like the metaphor is with a forest fire. Like a forest fire once in a while is a good thing because it gets rid of all the dead wood. But if there's never a fire and never gets rid of it, then the dead wood builds up and builds up. And then like when there is a forest fire, it burns the entire thing down. So the way this relates to kind of humans is that we need to be willing to let go of things which we are maybe attached to help us to move forward. So if your beliefs are actually holding you back, you don't want to be so attached to them that they actually stop you from progressing to a more progressing to whatever you want, a more fulfilling life, a more peaceful life, whatever it is, if you're so attached to them that you're not willing to let go of them for something better, then that's a problem. But you should be able to. But on the other side, you need to have the strength to stand up for them as well, or else you don't really stand for anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way of phrasing it with the deadwood. I mean, then, but talking about identifying with your group, we could get into the argument of like group identity and group politics. Like, how important is it to fight for the group you belong to, or how important is it to put the rights of the individual over the rights of the group?
Yeah,
which is
a very difficult, complicated question.
Yeah, we could explore that now. Or we could maybe explore it in a future episode.
Yeah, well, it's something we spoke about before in terms of like individualist versus collectivist values.
Yeah, like social values and stuff.
Yeah, I think you do need to. You know, it's not so. You mentioned kind of the problem there of like group identities, and that actually encourages like less free thinking and less honesty in pursuit of truth. You're just out to satisfy the group. That's more important to you than what's actually right or what's actually true.
Yeah.
But I think what needs to happen, and perhaps this is what religion offers, is it offers a set of values that everyone aspires to, and through having the same values that they aspire to, that's what makes them a group. They're not arbitrarily in this tribal mindset of just following whatever,
right?
Following something just because everyone else is. They're following something because they've set out these highest values that they're all aligned to, and perhaps having that as like a society helps you move forward. And this perhaps links into an argument for why societies with religion, why kind of all societies around the world and all great empires seem to have seem to be built upon a religion, or seem to be built upon a religion. Perhaps it's kind of a natural selection thing where in order to become such a powerful society, you need a religion to bind people towards a set of values, so that you can work together towards a higher goal. Because without that, you're always going to be conflicted, and you can't progress unless you're all kind of aligned in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think, for a society to be strong, like people need to be willing to fight for the values that they uphold. But obviously, it's difficult because if you look at like Nazi Germany or something, like their totalitarian values, and obviously, but there's a whole discussion there about that. Like that was a society, kind of a secular society, but without religion, kind of the state becomes, without a god, the state becomes a god. So that's how these ideas become the highest value for people. But obviously in that case, aspiring to those values and carrying them out for the sake of the state obviously leads to terrible things, as it did with Nazi Germany. So, I guess to kind of summarize back to your point, about kind of collectivist versus individual values, I think, it's good to be in a group where you're aligned towards a common ideal, but you shouldn't be arbitrarily tied to agreeing with everything in the group and not willing to stand for the truth when the group becomes corrupt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough path to navigate, especially like getting into I think we're going to do an episode in the future on it, like getting to the idea of what is truth and how truthful should this be in your mind compared to someone else's mind. And is someone's truth more important than yours? Which is just, I think it's I think that idea is kind of possibly one of the biggest factors in why there is conflict. People have conflicting truths, and because they're true to each other, it's worth almost dying for, and it's also worth killing another person over. which is just crazy. But we can dive into that a bit more in like more depth in future episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so talking about truth and like philosophy and stuff and religion, do you think that like philosophers would have to be a philosopher, you have to act in accordance of your teachings? Like I don't know how true this is, but like what I just said then, but separate to that, like Marcus Aurelius, his book Meditations is like one of the like most influential books in terms of Stoic philosophy. But he wasn't writing that book to be a philosopher. He wasn't writing it to teach people these things. These were like, it was genuinely just a diary of his own thoughts and himself trying to teach himself how to live a life he thought worth living. But he ended up becoming a philosopher, and I think you could argue he probably acted for the majority of the time with accordance of those teachings. But to be a true philosopher, do you need to act, or do you need to actively try and act within the philosophy's like values, or what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, I guess it's difficult to say because it might just come down to the definition of a philosopher. Like, it depends how you define it, but that answer isn't really very helpful. But yeah, I think like if someone has a philosophy, it's obviously not a good sign on behalf of the philosophy if they don't act it out in their own lives, or they don't, or their own lives aren't going particularly well.
I would
Like,
agree,
it's not,
because if I gave you really good advice but didn't use that own advice for myself, that advice could work for you and it could work for 1,000 other people. And just because I don't try and live my life by that advice, does that necessarily mean that the advice I've given you is worthless, even if it's helped you and 1,000 other people?
No, it doesn't. But I didn't say it necessarily meant the advice was bad. It doesn't necessarily mean the philosophy is bad, but it's not a good sign for it.
Right.
It's like it indicates that it's less likely to be right. Whereas you gave the example of Marcus Aurelius, who was someone who followed out his own philosophy, and it obviously did him very well, and he lived a good life because of it. Like, that's an indicator. So yeah, it acts as an indicator. So it doesn't necessarily determine whether it's good or bad, but yeah, it's an indicator for how likely it is to be good. If someone doesn't follow it, then, you know, it's maybe less likely to be as good. Although, you know, I guess with the question, do you have to follow your own philosophy to be a philosopher? The answer is probably no, because like you said there, you gave the example that someone might be able to give really good advice, but they don't necessarily follow it themselves, but it still helps a lot of other people. And I think we do kind of see, like, a lot of philosophers do end up, you know, because a lot of them have their own struggles and difficulties, and I think it comes with being, like, a factor in that as being a very creative person, very highly intelligent and highly creative. Like, that's associated with things like schizophrenia and kind of like losing your mind a little bit later in life. Like, that happens to a lot of creative people. So that might make it more difficult for them to act out their philosophies. But yeah, I don't think it's not necessarily a negative indicator on the philosophy. How much do you think do you think it's essential for someone to act out their own philosophy for it to have value? And, you know, maybe if not, like, how much of effect does it have on the philosophy if the person doesn't follow it?
Yeah. I think the value in the teachings will be there regardless of the fact if the philosopher, who's just an individual who has their own individual struggles, because they're not following it, that's not necessarily a bad representation of the philosophy. It might just be a bad representation of that individual, which I think you might be able to separate. But you could argue, if the philosophy is that amazing, should it not be able to help individuals even if they are in like the worst part of the journey of their life? So if it's truly like the best philosophy ever, it should reach out to everybody in every situation, you could argue. So maybe there is a bit of tension there. But regardless of that, like you were saying, these crazy people who have these crazy ideas teach so many people how to live better lives. And I think there is a real benefit in that. But then again, I guess maybe like these might be a bit abstract to use these ideas, but like the religious beliefs of Scientology v Buddhism, like is it Scientology or Mormonism? I think it was one of them. Was started by like a young kid who was a bit of a con man, and ended up creating this religion and has this following for 100 years or whatever it is. The values that are in that religion probably do help people become more successful and live a better, healthier life. But it was created by this person who was a bit crazy. Whereas Buddhism, for example, the Buddha did definitely act in accordance with what he taught. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, Buddhism is more rounded as a healthier religion. It definitely, in my mind, has more benefits to the individual. Although I've not explored either religion like extensively, but just on face value, you could argue Buddhism is more important in terms of helping people than Scientology or like Mormonism, whichever one it is.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not necessary for the teacher or philosopher to act within accordance of what they teach, but you could argue it's a true testament to the teachings, and it gives the teachings more value when you have an actual example to follow.
Yeah, like I was thinking there kind of, so we're having this discussion like what makes a philosopher, but just because someone's a philosopher doesn't mean they're a good one, or doesn't mean that their philosophy is very good. Like they can, I guess, to qualify as a philosopher, all you need to do is to have a philosophy and to write about it.
Yeah.
I guess that technically would make you a philosopher, whereas it might not make you a good one. And in terms of like, is it essential for the philosopher to act in accordance with their philosophy in order to be a philosopher? I don't think I don't think it necessarily is. And I also think just because someone acts in line with their own philosophy doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good philosophy. Like someone's philosophy might, rather than it being they have this philosophy and they decide to act upon it, rather for a lot of people they might act in a certain way, and then because they're biased about it, they use their philosophy to justify it.
Right.
So we spoke about in the last episode how it's important to take people's advice with a grain of salt, because ultimately everyone's advice is going to be kind of biased, and it might not necessarily be what they think, what is truly right based on what they've rationally considered. It might just simply be confirming what they've done in the past. So in terms of philosophy, like I'll give an example about like someone with kind of a communist, Marxist philosophy, anti-capitalist philosophy.
Yeah.
Like if this person hasn't worked very hard throughout their life and they're not very successful in the capitalist system, they might bring forth a Marxist type of philosophy. That might be the philosophy that they have.
Yeah.
And they do follow that type of philosophy by not participating in the competitive environment of capitalism. But that doesn't mean that doesn't serve well for the philosophy. It's just because they decide to act in accordance with it doesn't make it a good philosophy.
Yeah, it's just used as an irrational explanation of why what they're doing is
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, you say irrational there. It might not, like, the point of it is they're trying to rationalize what they're doing. So, but,
Okay.
I guess that comes into that argument of what even is rationality.
Yeah. I guess it's irrational to me because it wouldn't be what I'd rationally choose to do or believe.
Yeah. But they're trying to justify their negative actions in a rational way.
Yeah. Can you necessarily put people down for that, or?
Yeah, I think you can. If they're making excuses, put them down all you like. Yeah, you definitely can. Not sure if you should, but yeah, I mean, yeah, you can criticize people for just saying things and believing things for the sake of confirming their own, rationalizing their own decisions and confirming their own biases. Like, you can criticize. I think that's a reasonable reason to criticize people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you might be right. Talking of like rational thinking, in my mind, I had the question like, can you, as a person, claim to be a follower of a religion if you like openly commit sins? Like, for example, if you're the Catholic, and there's a few rules, like you have to eat only fish on Fridays or something like that. You can't wear more than one type of fabric. Like, can you claim to be a true Catholic if you're committing sins? Although those might be kind of just menial sins.
Yeah.
Maybe there's more cardinal sins that get committed openly, like sex before marriage or adultery. And
yeah, you gave the example of, like, what was it, like a rapper talking about certain things.
So there was like a rapper. I just saw a clip of it. I don't know who it was. It was just some low key rapper, and he was saying in this music video, talking about like fucking bitches and like getting loads of hoes and shit. And then like later on or before, he was talking about how he needs to make sure he's eating halal food or something.
Yeah.
And it was just they're just so contradictory.
Yeah.
You're trying to act like you're fucking this little saint in your religion when you're going to go out and fuck loads of bitches.
Yeah, that is haram, as they would put it. Yeah, can you be I guess you can be a follower of the religion, but you're just not a very good one.
Yeah.
I don't know. But what do you reckon? Are you not a true follower of the religion if you don't act it out? Or can you not necessarily act out the teachings but still believe in them? And does that still make you a religious person?
Yeah, I think it's most likely impossible for someone to truly act out the teachings of their religion. And I think that's fine because it's just human nature to be... what's the word? It's just human
imperfect.
nature. Yeah, to be imperfect. And you'll never be able to be perfect, and that's fine. So I don't know if you need to follow every single thing and never commit a sin to be a true follower. But in that example I gave, I think those sorts of sins, for example, they are manageable and they can be like diverted and not committed. So if you're doing something like that, you aren't necessarily a true follower. But that doesn't mean that you don't benefit from the religion, or you, on the other way around, you don't benefit the religion. Like that rapper, for example, might be a huge person in charity work in his community. And like, should we get a scale out and outweigh the sins from the benefits that the person brings to that religion, or the religion brings to them? Or is that trying to like think about it too, like, empirically?
Yeah, I see your point there. I think it is like everyone's got their own issues, and it shouldn't necessarily criticize other people for their moral shortcomings. It's like a religious saying: don't criticize like the speckle in someone's eye if you have a rock in yours or some shit. I think I butchered that, but it's basically like don't criticize others before looking at yourself, like that type of idea.
He was without sin cast the first stone.
Yeah, like that type of thing. Yeah, much better than mine. But but yeah,
I mean, that was one of my favorite sayings from a religious text so far.
Yeah, so in terms of religion, like just like, you know, everyone sins, so you don't want to kind of ridicule people for not necessarily living up to the highest possible expectations, because perhaps, you know, they're still doing better than they would otherwise. But there is an argument that it is, you know, quite fundamentally wrong for example, this rapper to be talking about to be putting himself out there as a religious person and saying that, you know, he has certain beliefs if he clearly is not following them, and he's just like his value system and the way he lived his life is fundamentally not aligned with the teachings of his religion. Like they're not. He's got this idea that he just doesn't act in accordance with. Like you could argue that that's not, you know, a good person in a way.
Yeah, especially maybe it's worse because he's promoting it to the the audience of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although, like, it's not necessarily that he was actually explicitly saying, I am a Muslim and I am a follower of Islam. Maybe it's that he just dissected Islam and took away different teachings from it. And one idea that he liked was the idea of halal food or like other things. And I think as an individual, it's perfectly okay and maybe better to dissect different philosophies and ideas of beliefs, and then take out the bits that identify with you. And then you don't have to stick yourself into this one group of I am a Muslim or I am a Stoic or I am a Marxist or whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what he's doing. I don't know. Maybe I was prejudging him.
Yeah, like with that type of person, like it's hard to really say that they're doing it out of that's what they morally think to be right. Like perhaps I'm being a bit judgmental and I shouldn't be, but it kind of seems like he's just choosing beliefs based on what suits him, like what's easier for him.
Yeah.
Like he's not willing to give up the pleasure of pursuing women in this example for the sake of going with his religion, but something easy that he can kind of virtue signal about, saying that he's a good Muslim is something easier is to eat halal meat. But yeah, maybe you can't really judge him or try and hold, you know, it comes to a conversation of should you really be trying to hold other people to a certain moral standard, as opposed to just focusing on yourself. But yeah, I think, you know, to the question, can someone be religious and a religious follow without following the beliefs? I guess the answer is yes, but you know, it doesn't necessarily make them a good one. And obviously everyone's got room for improvement, but some more than others. And to some extent, like there'll be some people who, you know, just the fact of being a human, we make mistakes and stuff. And we won't always live up to the religious ideal because we're not perfect. Yeah. But there is another side to it where certain people claim to be religious, but the way they act is fundamentally not in line with the religion they say they are. And you could argue that that's not a true kind of religious person.
Yeah, and they're breaking the fundamentals. And yeah, I think you're right then. Yeah. Right. Anything else you want to talk about, Pete?
I think that's good for an episode.
Yeah,
to be fair.
It's nice. Good to be back. To be fair, I think we've not necessarily lost the touch. Well, maybe we never had it, but
yeah.
But yeah, it's been good. Been good to chat again. Nice to explore these ideas.
As always.
Yeah, so I think my camera might be a bit dodgy for you viewers. Sorry about that. I will try and fix it. We'll get a replacement. It should be fine for the next episode.
Nice.
All right, well, anyway, thank you very much, guys. It's currently 11:32 a.m. on my watch. That is the episode for today. Thanks for joining. Check us out on Spotify if you like to listen on the go. Subscribe and like, all that shit. Much appreciated. Thank you. Goodbye.
See ya.